to our panel discussion. Thank you, Professor Chen. Thanks for a great conversation. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Let's bring our panelists up. Okay. You can sit here. Sure. Okay, everyone, thanks so much. We've made it through a wonderful, intellectually stimulating day, and we're going to wrap things up today with a conversation about multilateralism. We haven't really discussed multilateralism yet, and we've got an exceptionally well-positioned panel to share their thoughts and educate us all about China, the United States, and multilateral questions. The closing keynote here is actually titled Competing Visions, U.S., China, and the New Rules of the Game. You can see our speakers' bios behind me. I am not going to take time going into detail on their bios, but I think you have a good sense of their expertise and the kind of deep experience they'll be able to bring to this question. This is going to be a very interactive discussion. We're not going to have initial presentations the way we have had with some of the other conversations. And then we're going to open this up. I'm going to engage each of our panelists in a back and forth, and I'm sure they will engage each other too, where there are areas of agreement and disagreement. And then we'll open it up for a great question and answer with all of you here today. The first thing I just wanted to highlight for all of us with this question of competing visions. I'd like to ask each of our panelists, before we dive into your specific areas of expertise on China and multilateral questions, I'd like to ask each of you to speak for maybe 2 to 3 minutes, not a long period of time, but on what these competing visions are as you understand it, and how would you describe China's desired international order. That'll help us level set for diving more deeply into the conversation. Professor Lee.
Well, first of all, just want to thank the hosts and GW, and also my dear friend Deng Xiwei and your institute for really organizing this. I learned a great deal from the speakers, especially those from the U.S. and also from my other colleagues. The competing vision, I think that you see that China now want to move from to the center stage of international affairs, slowly but surely, and largely hold the multilateralism and try to engage with all partners, including United States. When you look at the narrative of Xi Jinping's 4 initiatives, actually, if you just do not know who wrote this, who talked about that, I when I was in U.S., I share with my colleagues, at Brookings and other colleagues, just to look at the Xi Jinping's speech, but I did not tell who wrote that. Most of the people said it's pretty good. But actually, when I told them this is Xi Jinping wrote, then the reaction will be different. So I think that China already take the more high kind of the moral high ground at the time that the U.S. obsessed with the unilateralism, like America alone, or so-called authoritarianism versus democracy under the Biden administration, which is too narrow, too outdated, and also ironically, very ironic because most Democrats consider Donald Trump is part of this kind of authoritarianism. So where you put him or put the U.S. in the spectrum, and also so-called the Nixon or Kissinger reverse. This is a kind of 3 kingdom. This is also out of reality. So I think we will enter a new era characterized by, I will not use the polarity, but maybe clusters, maybe 6 or 7. This is a unique period. It's not the international order or structure we are very familiar with. So I think that one thing that China tried very hard to establish international institutions. And along with the multilateralism, just the past few months, within 6 months, China established 5 international institutions in Shanghai, in Beijing, and also in Hong Kong in terms of international organizational mediation. At the moment, most Africa or Asian countries start to participate. Just a few days ago, that there's a UN, United Nations working group, also has 40-some countries. So you can see the tremendous effort has been made. And one important thing is Li Qiang in the UN also mentioned that China should take more responsibility. So in a way, do not want to take too much kind of like the developing countries. You see the policy change. It's to try to accommodate these kind of things. But I will also tell some of the problems, but let me first to show the contrast of the competing vision at the moment.
Professor Quah.
Well, thank you for that opening question. I do not live or work in either of the great powers. So I am asked about US, China, and competing visions. I have to be frank. I find there are many appealing characteristics of the vision each presents, but there are also many troubling characteristics. And I say this to you not because I'm from a small state, but because those of us who do not live in either the United States nor China, we are 80% of humanity. And the 80% of humanity has more often than not had to live by the rules of the other 20%. But of course, it is a long abiding dictum of international relations that the great powers do what they will, and the rest of us suffer what we must. But this is a time when the international order is being hugely disrupted. First of all, by the architect that built it, the United States, and second, by an alternative great power whose vision, while it's consistent with globalization and multilateralism, something that all the rest of humanity subscribes to, sometimes has different understanding. So I'm going to begin this opening by saying that we, 80% of humanity, find difficulties with both visions. We are under no illusion. The current system, globalization and multilateralism, has benefited us hugely, small states most of all. If you look at the 9 richest countries in the world by per capita, for 8 of them, the average population is 4 million. That's smaller than Singapore. Small states in the current system have been magnificently successful. So when we see the current system being torn down because America is aggrieved with the distribution of rewards that come from the multilateral system, because China's vision of it has sharp elbows that many of us find difficulty adjusting to, we feel we need a new way forwards. So let me end by saying the 80% of humanity, I would argue, strongly favors a continued globalization and multilateralism. That has worked for us. It's given us a level playing field, a commitment to peaceful dispute resolution, and a tendency to collaborate on large global challenges. We don't understand, well, we do understand why it's being torn down. Maybe we can come back to the reasons, but we see a way forwards that I think of as a new kind of multilateralism. You can think of it as pathfinder multilateralism, where small groups get together and discover new ways to do multilateral things. Or if you think that the great powers are inappropriately disturbing the current system, you can think of it as an incentive-compatible multilateralism, one that we need to build where the great powers no longer seek to tear it down. So that's how I think we can make progress, and I hope to explore the details of that with you in due course in this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Tsai.
Well, hard act to follow. As a political scientist who focuses more on China's domestic political economy, I think it's important to take a step back and remember like where China came from. It actually has benefited from the liberal international order, acceding to the WTO, and it benefited from free trade, and as a result has now gotten to the point that it has a $1 trillion trade surplus, which is perceived as very threatening to certain countries, including the US. But in terms of competing visions, before I get to that, I just want to point out that actually both countries have been acting out of a self-diagnosed sense of deep insecurity, albeit for somewhat different reasons, both due to structural challenges that emerged in their economy, in their growth models over time. So with China, by the late 2000s, by the 2010s, there were already creeping sources of perceived domestic insecurity as well as international insecurity. And so it's been over a decade now that Chinese leadership has been operating according to this notion of comprehensive national security with like 17 different types of security, including cybersecurity, economic security, ocean security, you name it. And so after a full decade of this securitization of all of society and the economy, including legislation that requires firms to adhere to the government's sense of security. This has led to significant backlash on the international stage to China's various economic activities. So fast forward to where we are now in terms of competing visions. I won't restate what led the current president to get a pretty significant portion of the working class and lower middle class vote. But now what we're seeing is the US is retreating. The 2025 new national security strategy explicitly asks traditional allies like Japan to take care of Trans-Pacific security, Europeans to take care of European security, Taiwan to increase defense spending. And meanwhile, perhaps paradoxically, China is explicitly calling for multilateralism. It's calling for, it's warning against unilateralism and hegemonism. It's calling for peace and cooperation, it's calling for the UN to play its role and for all countries to have an equal vote. So it's just ironic that things have rather flipped. China, as Li Cheng mentioned, is actually articulating precisely the rules of multilateralism and the norms that originally emerged in the post-war order. So we're at an inflection point now where China and the US are both discursively and also partially in practice starting to trade roles.
Thank you. Professor Wei, and maybe you could speak from the perspective of multilateral international financial institutions, given your expertise.
Sure. When it comes to this term competing visions, if you live in the bubble of CNN, New York Times, one automatically think about China versus the West having competing visions. In fact, in terms of international finance, international trade, and many other areas, nowadays you will find many common grounds between China and many other countries, whereas U.S. often takes a different views. For example, in terms of what is the international architecture one wants to govern global climate actions, global climate policies. Clearly, Europe and China share more common views, and both are very different from current U.S. government. When it comes to international trade, U.S. ironically since President Obama times, not President Trump, U.S. has systematically eroded the functioning of WTO by refusing to appoint members of the appellate court judges, making the dispute settlement mechanism of WTO functioning less well, whereas both Europe, China, smaller countries very much want WTO to function better as it was before. You talk about reforms, but you want to keep the existing system, and they all vote to elect, or most countries, China, Europe included, other than U.S., elect to partially restore the WTO dispute settlement mechanisms. International financial institutions. Now, one automatically think, when you think about Chinese approach to assisting developing countries, Western media emphasize a lot about debt trap and those kind of terms, strongly suggesting what China wants is very different from what the traditional stakeholding countries want. But if you look at the when China had a chance to design global its international financial institutions, AIIB and NIB, New Development Bank and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and they want to set up a governance structure. Who do they model after? If they model after World Bank, they explicitly want. So, what does that mean, governance? Since I spent a bit of time at several different international institutions, let me break it down to you. What does it mean for governance of international financial institutions? For every loan project, here's how World Bank does this. Under the previous U.S. and European leadership, you want financial safeguard from every project has to satisfy a cost-benefit analysis in financial terms. You want a social safety net. Suppose you want a project requires to moving a community out of the project site to somewhere else. What rules do you have to follow to make sure that no community is made worse off by that project? When it comes to every project requires environmental assessment. Does the project on net contributes to mitigate environmental problem rather than making it worse? Each of these are the concrete sense in which the governance, the rules that governing the multilateral institutions. When China get a chance to set up AIIB, does it try to get rid of this? No, it says, how does World Bank do this? We want to do the exact same thing. In fact, invite lawyers from European countries and US. In fact, I think the very first general counsel of AIIB was American, even though US declined to join this. And AIIB extended the invitation to, I think it was former World Bank General Counsel Office, Deputy General Counsel, someone working in the multinational institutions, invited to be AIIB's first General Counsel. These are signs that shows that there are areas, clearly views don't always converge, but there are many concrete areas in which what China wants seems to be shared by many other countries. So I guess the last point I want to make is when you think about other national governments or other international organizations thinking about having a dialogue with China, there are actually quite a few common areas one can build on to make the existing international system with China to function better than try to focus just on where we compete, where we differ. Let me start with this. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to come back now to Professor Lee. One of the really interesting things that's emerged in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years or so in the multilateral space, first, seeing China's deepened engagement with a variety of different specialized UN agencies, and China's role also, as you just described, for example, with the AIIB or the NDB, creating alternate kinds of multilateral organizations that are also vehicles for Chinese global leadership. Professor Lee, you've written recently about the idea of East rising, West falling. You've said that this is a little bit more nuanced than that simple framework. I'd love to hear more about this.
Well, first, I largely agree. The historical transformation characterized by the East rising and the Western decline. Of course, but also I want to add, the real story actually is a rebalancing rather than East rising, Western declining. Now, there are five or six clarifications should be made. First, the so-called East and the West, this time, it's not ideological nature. It's not like a Cold War. This is number one. Number two, East rise and Western decline is not necessarily the one caused the other. Could be coexistence. So it's a correlation, not a causation. I think that's a self damage, like what happened to Donald Trump, to Harvard or Columbia and etc. This has nothing to do with China. And also that the West, also including Europe, there's some also serious problem in Europe itself, not necessarily caused by China. And number three, the so-called East, it's not just about China. It's include, ASEAN countries, global South. Actually, Chinese leadership use global South more often than East, right? Now, my friend Kish Mababuni actually had a term talk about CIA countries. It's not the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, but the C is China, I is Indian, A is ASEAN countries. 20-some years ago, middle class is a very small number in this region. But now it's 40% of middle class in the world. So this is the so-called East and the West. And also East and West, it's a relative term. United States is still the most powerful country in terms of economy, military, technology, finance, and soft power, although all decline, relatively speaking. Now, economically, maybe you can see GDP, but GDP is not only criteria to look at that, but also the potential financial crisis is also, we should keep that in mind. So it's a relative term. And also that it's very, very important. It's not that sometimes East rise or Western decline could last for decades or even half century, but could be very short. Let's imagine if America has the financial crisis like what happened in 1929, because a lot of economists in the world worry about that. That could be accelerate. So could be short. It will be devastating for the United States. So this leads me to last point. It's not a zero-sum game. Now, it will hit the US, hit West, already hitting, but China may or may not benefit. China will be cautious. So these are the clarifications should be made when you talk about Eastern rise and the Western decline. But the overall, that tells us the trend. But it may or may not relate to us. It's an individual living in the world because it could be a longer period, right? But I think that I would use the term, it's a rebalancing, right? The previous structure probably unfair. And I think that's related with multilateralism and related to the world we just, experience, the new era we enter. So let me stop here.
Wonderful, thank you. Professor Quah, let's come back to what you were saying about Pathfinder multilateralism. In some ways, this sounds quite a bit like the concept of global swing states. Can you speak a little bit more about how you see a kind of evolving multilateral framework that takes into greater consideration global swing states or other states that seek a larger voice?
Thank you for that. Actually, let me be upfront. I do not think the idea of global swing states is a good one. Okay. Just like I don't think that if the great powers are any more interested in engaging with the rest of us, we should look to the middle powers. I don't think that's a good strategy either. The challenge that we now face, it seems to me, is a little bit where I disagree with my good colleague here. The system that we had was a system that worked. It was a system of a level playing field, a rules-based order that was based on the consent of the governed and in accordance with the organized opinion of humanity. It was a flat structure that benefited everyone. Even as small states grew rich, so did the great powerful states. America today is 26% of the world's GDP, as it was 25 years ago. China is 15 times the size in GDP than it was 25 years ago. Everyone has benefited. There is no zero-sum game in the world. There's no idea that one group has benefited more than others. Having said that, nonetheless, there is a tearing away of the fabric of multilateralism. Why? Well, that's a question that I think, those of us who live in the great powers need to ask our leaders. But from where I sit, outside of these two great powers, there is a dissatisfaction in that one side now, in a pursuit of global hegemony, considers the other side a challenge. America has said, in the words of a number of individuals in the Department of State, the Department of War, that the continued rise of an alternative hegemon in the Indo-Pacific will not be tolerated. The continued ascent of China, whether it is a democracy or otherwise, will sharply constrain our freedom of actions and our prospects in the region. When you look at the world that way, you have cast the world into a zero-sum game, because one must be number one and the other number two. But the reality of it is, in terms of numbers, actually everyone can benefit. So the great problem, it seems to me, is that we are unable to correct this perception of the world. But it is up to the people who live in these societies to speak up to their leaders and say, this is not what we want. The world that we want is one that actually allowed all of us to be prosperous. And the reason that some part of us, the 80% of humanity who've run off, the reason that they've chosen a way of pathfinder multilateralism is not because they're angry at us, but because they can't live with us anymore. They would welcome us. We would welcome everyone in a world of pathfinder multilateralism. But we cannot do it if the great powers feel that they have to disrupt the system to advantage themselves, whereas the experience of the last 8 decades has totally contradicted that idea.
Well, can I?
A two-finger follow-up here?
Well, I really disagree with my dear friend. You made several, I think, errors, very bluntly. First, who wants to change the current system? China benefits from the system. China wants to just improve or reform the system, not to replace it. But the United States under Donald Trump want to give up, throw out of the window, right? Number two, you mentioned the number one power, number two power, probably reflect the Thucydides trap. Now, I'm asking you, which country, existing power or emerging power, is more insecure? And number three, China did not have the 700 military base. Now, the way you treat it sounds like equally, problematic. That's kind of equal treatment. Of course, China should improve. Actually, I will tell China's problems, right? But it's different level problem. So you treat this as equal. I think that probably reflects some of the, I love Singapore, but there's some terrible things going on. They think that Singapore should position itself between Japan and China, but even into historic perspective, that's a terrible mistake. That I think China will react very, very strongly. You lose your immediate small power, the great tradition from Li Guangyu and from your older statesmen. So I think that's a thing that's very, very worrisome.
I need to correct the profound.
Okay, quickly, because I want to make sure we get to our other balance.
Let me be clear. I don't blame China. I don't blame the United States. There are cost-benefit calculations that each is making that's making them think this is the way ahead. For America, America will not tolerate the rise of a number two that challenges it. For China, its relentless pursuit of manufacturing and technical prowess has benefited the world hugely. But at the same time, it is totally tone deaf to how industries and governments and people and workers in target countries feel unable to compete with its prowess. On the consumer side, we write China a thank you note. On the producer side, we wanted to show a bit of understanding. That's all it is. And let me put to one side the totally unjustified and unwarranted comments that my good colleague here has described of Singapore. They are total misinterpretation, and we must not go on record as endorsing that. But that will need to expand on some other time, I think. I just do not think that what he said is correct.
Okay. I'd like to move to Professor Tsai. Can I ask a question, or do you have an immediate intervention?
I have a bit of a two-finger,
okay.
too.
All right.
Yeah, so I just want to say that the current Trump administration, there is not internal consensus about the China strategy. And so I think it's important to not exaggerate the sense of competition, because the most recent 2025 new national security strategy for the US actually does not mention great power competition for the first time. It's the first time that Russia is not singled out and China is not singled out. And it reflects, at least most recently, a greater sense of retreat, the US retreating and really expecting other countries to take care of their own security. So I don't think it's nearly as antagonistic directly as you may have just characterized. And the second thing I want to react to is I don't think China would agree that the post-war multilateral system was fair and equal to everyone, because it's been creating parallel development banks and institutions. Greg Chin has got a great Cambridge element with Kevin Gallagher talking about how China is not just a rule taker, but also a rule maker and a rule shaker. And so it's precisely because the IMF imposed really harsh or from China's perspective, difficult conditionalities. You have to agree to structural adjustment, which can be very painful for lower income countries. The bank can be very bureaucratic, and so the AIIB is much more efficient. The China development, they're streamlined. So these are alternative and parallel. They're not necessarily going to substitute completely, but there are a fair number of empirical studies that are now accumulating showing that there has been some displacement of the World Bank's infrastructural lending to countries that are now getting loans from AIIB. So I think we need to keep an eye on that kind of parallel coexistence.
Let me ask you a follow-up. I mean, from what you have seen, given your expertise, is there a Chinese approach to multilateralism, a specifically Chinese approach?
Well, in discourse, there definitely is. I mean, I think the discourse is very equitable, generous, inclusive. It's about peace. It's about cooperation. It's about national sovereignty, not interfering in the affairs of other countries. It's about giving all countries an equal voice. Like, it keeps repeating equality again, regardless of size. That's actually explicitly articulated. It is it's repeating back the rules-based international order. It's arguing against protectionism. It's arguing for free trade. So that's not necessarily distinctively Chinese, but it is articulated in a way that is echoing many of the norms that are embedded in these institutions, at least in discourse.
And
To Finger, can I just one sentence?
I want to make sure we
Okay.
can hear from Professor Wei. Professor Wei. I'd like to follow up, just given your experience as both a scholar and with time in multilateral development banks. How do you see the evolving roles of the U.S. and Europe-led World Bank and IMF, and then now the China-led AIIB, like the parallel structures? What does this landscape really look like? How are they working in parallel? What does each do? Can you speak a little bit more about that?
First of all, let me suggest multiple international institutions look into the issue about what they call a funding gap, that how much additional funding developing countries need. They all come up with gigantic numbers. One can question about whether they're, how rigorous their methodologies are, but there seems to be a common view by development economists and development institutions that global South, however you define it, on balance needs a lot more inflow of technology, inflow of money, and so on. In that regard, having more multilateral development banks be, whether they are dominated by US, Japan, or China, can be helpful. That's the first point. Second point is, you look at the governance structure, as I was pointing out. In fact, they are not as different as one might think. So they all seems to agree on common set of environmental rules, social safeguard, and financial cost benefit calculations. So to the extent they compete a little bit, that's actually good. So on net, developing countries benefit from that kind of competition. So, Kelly pointed out about the efficiency with which AIIB is run, and so what this
underlying this statement is because AIIB is relatively newly formed when it was being formed. I don't work for AIIB. I have never worked for AIIB, just so I worked for a different institution before. But AIIB, I didn't look into its founding history. You look at existing institutions and did ask itself, how can we run more efficiently? So unlike other development banks, AIIB choose not to have a resident board of directors, choose to have a lot more efficiency in terms of, the number they often cite is dollar amount of loan per staff. That ratio is a lot higher for AIIB than for World Bank or all Asian Development Bank. They're very part of this. And that's a saving for global tax payers. So therefore, I think one perhaps shouldn't overemphasize competition and differences, but should also look at potential complementarities and the fact that developing countries as a whole benefit from having additional players. Maybe the last thing I want to point out, it's very common to read China's AIIB and national development banks is China's way to assert itself. One sometimes forget from another important fact, which is that China's foreign exchange reserve became gigantic since about mid-2005 or so and onwards. AIIB was established a decade later. And why the delay? Because what happened during this decade? In between periods, China tried very hard trying to work with the existing system, asking to have more voice, asking to give more money to World Bank, more money to IMF, more subscription to IMF quotas in return for proportional increasing in voice. It was rejected. So after a decade of waiting, this finally says maybe we are sitting on such a high pile of foreign assets that was not earning very high return in dollar terms, potentially negative returns in Chinese local currency term, given the dollar RMB exchange rate movement at the time. Therefore, it's so inexpensive, we should do our own institutions. So that piece of history is worth bearing in mind as well. That is, those institutions were set up after repeated efforts to try to work within system.
Absolutely. No, thanks for reminding us of that history. I'm going to go down the row one more time with a question for each of our wonderful panelists, and then we'll open it up. I think you can see we've already got some very lively differences of opinion and expertise, and so I'm sure we'll have some great conversation too with all of our participants today. But Professor Lee, I wanted to come back to this question. You alluded to it a bit earlier, this concept of a G2. What does that mean when the U.S. president talks about it? He has been talking about this a little bit more lately. What does that mean for China?
Well, before I answer the question, I want to echo what my friend Kelly said. It's not the Chinese way. It's not sometimes not the distinctive Chinese, but of course there's a Chinese component, a cultural component, like a middle ground, not to see things black and white and etc. Just give an example that when I started studying the U.S. In middle 80s and especially 90s and the turn of century, the one key word in the U.S. Social science discourse is governance. But ironically, I see that the discussion of the use of this word significantly dropped. Only probably some foundation like Bill Gates Foundation or other people, NGOs, talk about the governance, right? In today's our discussion, also that the word hardly appear. But in Chinese discussion about the world affairs, if you go to Beijing, Shanghai, or elsewhere, this is the frequently used word. So that word is learned from the West, learned from the United States. But of course, the Trump administration never used that term, governance, right? Almost for sure. You see that change. That's why sometimes the China learn from the U.S., but now hold that kind of as the catchword term. Now, G2, certainly this is not a new term, but Donald Trump used that in his Twitter. I don't know whether he really know what he's talking about. And also no one knows whether he will change. Certainly China silently like the term because it's better than the America alone or American unilateralism and also better than the previously bloc thinking. And certainly that they gone. And also that some Chinese worry about Trump will use Russia to deal with China. This is also gone, right? But China will be very, very careful with that term. First of all, Americans not in the mood to talk about G2 with China, even there's agree with this disagreement in the foreign policy establishment. But I think Donald Trump is the exception. Secondly, when you use that term, you will alienate middle ground country, mid-sized country, small country. This is precisely my friend Daniel just mentioned. China will hesitant to use that term, and also not mention about Russia and the EU, how they look at that. But also, most importantly, when you talk about G2, should it be the concept of take responsibility, share burdens? But Donald Trump's not in that mood. He wants to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, withdraw from WHO, withdraw from the other commitments. So it's not a governance issue, right? So what's the point? But besides that, again, China stay with the multilateralism, will not go to that track. But silently, they may be happy with that. Now, the difficulty is how you look at today's world. Now, in AI, today we discussed that AI sounds like two superpowers with some other major powers. This is called the 两超多强, two superpowers and other major powers. Now, whether this is structure China will take or not, it's unclear. But both China and U.S. agree that the U.S. and China relations is the most important, consequential relationship. Now, that sounds like close to G2. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of ambiguities. But I think China will play around that, but will not accept it as the way to define today's world.
With a strict label.
Yeah.
So let's move to Professor Quah. Can you speak a little bit, with your perspective, how do you think small states plan to navigate this incredibly complex and ever-evolving multilateral environment?
Okay, so the first thing that we do is to recognize the causes of why world order is so fractured. Why is it so fragmented? I agree completely with Professor Kelly Tsai here that it's not just US-China confrontation. That's a convenient scapegoat. But if we focus first on America, America is dissatisfied with the current world because it feels that its people have not benefited enough from the international trading system. It's the only major country in the world where the bottom 50% of its population actually has suffered a drop in real income, not just relative to the rich, but an absolute drop in real income. It feels that it's no longer able to compete in a world where multipolarity has brought along many new champions. And I completely sympathize with that. It's doing the right cost-benefit calculation. But recognizing that means that the small nations in the world, small states in the world, realize that if we go forwards and we endow any larger state, a middle power or otherwise, with the same powers we have given the United States, at some point in the future, they will do that same calculation. They too will feel dissatisfied with the smaller pathfinder multilateral world that we're constructing. So we need to prevent that. So the world that we need to operate is one where being in the multilateral, the flexible multilateral system has got to be a dynamically incentive compatible option. Nations have to feel that they get something out of that. So the world that I envision is one that moves away from the hierarchy of power that has characterized world order for the last 500 years, but instead move to a situation where there's compatibility of incentives. The system needs to be self-supporting, and for this, small states are just as capable and just as deficient as middle powers or great powers. So the world that I envision is one that seeks to move away from the hierarchy and exercise of power to where we have a compatibility of incentives and decisions that are in the benefit of each individual state.
Okay, thank you. Professor Tsai, can you share with us your thinking on how China's domestic economic priorities impact its foreign policy priorities?
Yes, absolutely. I do think that ultimately the preoccupation of leaders in Beijing is more with its domestic situation. I mean, the external environment is feeling a bit threatening because of rising protectionism, but if you look at how China's economy has evolved, there are all sorts of structural challenges: overinvestment, underconsumption, weak domestic demand. There's at the most recent economic work conference, there was a call for cracking down on or rectifying involutionary competition, basically trying to deal with excessive internal competition, the sort of race to the bottom in certain sectors. And then there's the property sector, which accounts for about 20% of the GDP and is arguably in crisis already. There's an unfinished housing construction crisis, which is tied up with the unsustainability of local public finance. There's really accumulating local debt. This has been going on for decades. This is not a new phenomenon, but it is now at the point of like severe unsustainability, coupled with collapse in shadow banking in Zhejiang just earlier this week, affecting like over 10,000 investors. So these are the types of issues that they're structural, they're not easily fixed. And because of that, I think China's leaders really want a stable and hospitable international environment where they can continue. Because of overcapacity, world markets still need to be available for Chinese products. Confrontation with any power. I mean, China just wants to kind of, in a way, mind its own business. It does not want to get mired in regional conflicts or military conflicts. But I think that deep sense of insecurity keeps it from overcommitting to or doing anything that could trigger more complicated and expensive involvement.
Thank you. I will refrain at the moment from saying that I think from an Indian perspective, the border challenges with China feel a little bit like it doesn't necessarily try to refrain from conflict, but let me park that for the moment.
Fair enough, actually, in the Sino-Indian border, I would agree with you, yes.
We'll
Fair
park
enough.
that one. I'd like to go back to Professor Wei, and can you share with us how you see competing visions on industrial policy and trade policy affecting multilateral priorities?
So one of the obstacles I regarded certain pursuit of industrial policy is one of those things that is obstacles or barriers to potentially globally beneficial cooperations. So that's a perception. So I gave in my previous lecture presentation, I made a point that industrial policies perhaps are not the main cause of Chinese trade surplus. Nonetheless, if you talk to government leaders around the world, there's a strong set of people don't like a surplus, Chinese surplus. They worry about Chinese trade decimating their own industries. And in their intuition, they thought Chinese industrial policies are a very important source of a Chinese trade surplus. That's something that needs to be addressed. Similarly, one of the in Europe, back to the China-Europe potential cooperation example. Europe, many Europeans are saying yes, on climate, on assistance to third world countries, they see a lot of room for collaboration with China. But one of the obstacles they see is partly China's response to U.S. Trade barrier is by diverting exports that would have gone to U.S. market to many other markets, including to Europe at the same time. Even though in principle China could also divert things that used to import from U.S. to Europe and to imports from Europe and other countries, but we don't see enough of that, and they worry about that. And Europe is on the eve of erecting their massive import barriers on imports from China. They're pursuing their own industrial policy very aggressively, partly in response to, in their mind, to counter industrial policies in China and in U.S. Therefore, this excessive pursuit of industrial policy around the world could lead us to, for the world to a worse and worse situation. Even for some of the industrial policies that can be justified on an ex ante basis, some of the pro-environment policies that's as opposed to build on economy of a scale, can turn to socially inefficient policy if every country does this without coordination. So therefore, I do see a need for more discussion and more coordination to one needs to sort industrial policy into different buckets, right? So there are industrial policies that on an ex-ante basis can be justified. Pro-environmental policy is an example of this, but it requires some international coordination so they can do better. There are other industrial policies that are just distortionally. They're certainly bad for global well-being. They may very well be bad for national well-being, and China has no shortage of both type of industrial policy, and having a good framework to think through this and minimize those distortionally industrial policies, having a good international dialogue on those potentially welfare improving industrial policy will be very helpful.
Okay, wonderful. I know we have a bunch of questions here, so we're going to go ahead and open it up, and we're going to first call on Professor Saranovic to ask the first question.
Thank you. Fascinating discussion. And I'm really curious to get some of your opinions about the notion of U.S. and China's insecurities. China and the U.S. have so much going for it for so long. China has a long history. They have grown, they've been a dynamic growing economy for half a century now. It's been an economic miracle. The United States has so many advantages culturally, economically, and yet, Professor Tsai, you talked about how insecure they are, and I think that's absolutely right, and they're reacting to each other with this insecurity. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about the source of this great insecurity of the great powers, and I'd also love to hear your opinion, Professor Quah, as a smaller state, kind of how you see it, because I always tell my students, think about the U.S.-China discussion from the vantage point of a smaller state, and what they think about the conversations and the power that's being wrested against each other, and I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, briefly, I think the sources of insecurity are different for China and the U.S. For China, it was a combination of global financial crisis, end of the kind of export-led model or sense of potential slowing growth. In the lead up to the Beijing Olympics, there was concern about, security in all sorts of security. There were some issues in Xinjiang and Tibet leading up to that. Then there was externally, there was the Ed Snowden revelation that Huawei had been hacked in from the back door. And so that was a real turning point. I think the Snowden revelation that China was vulnerable and had to rely on its own technology, or else, it was too risky to rely on U.S. So that, and just all sorts of concern with domestic incidents as well. So that was China's perspective. For the U.S., I think it's actually quite different because I think it's been mobilized politically, that perception of insecurity, blaming globalization, blaming immigrants, blaming maybe China as well. So that I feel like that's more been mobilized politically, and that it could have been framed differently by another leader had there been an alternative leader, like a left populist as opposed to a right populist. So I'll leave it at that so other panelists have a chance to respond.
Thank you very much. I'm an economist. I don't know how to use the word insecurity in a sentence, but let me tell you my reasons for why I think America and China both are disruptive of the system. So first is that the competition with China from the perspective of America is not new. There was a time when, remember, a great US president said China threatens Taiwan and its neighbors, we should not strengthen it. China violates human rights and labor rights, we should not reward it. China is a proliferator, we should not empower it. The question is not whether we approve or disapprove of China. The question is, what's the smartest thing to do about it? And that president went on to think that the smartest thing to do was to bring China into the WTO, to make it a full-blown economic competitor. So that observation leads me to worry that it is not the structure of the problem that has changed, It is the personalities and the political mood of the time in the United States. And America feels insecure for economic reasons. First is the bottom half of its population has suffered terribly for the last 50 years. Now they've become politically pivotal voters, and they constitute the heart of the 80 million MAGA voters. Right? America has paid for a lot of the multilateral system, right? And it feels that it was justified in doing that at a time when its great competitor, the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, was against open markets and free trade. It was politically convenient for America to support those and build a multilateral world. Today, its great enemy is all for open markets and free trade. America can no longer tell that story. America needs a new story. So on China, why does China feel insecure? I agree with Kelly. China talks the multilateralism talk, and we all welcome it. But it also behaves in a way that is not always consistent with being a responsible, conscientious member, equal with all others in the multilateral system. A very simple example. Singapore said that it welcomed the presence of Japan in Southeast Asia because that would make for greater peace and prosperity, and that it had worked through its historical challenges with Japan. China responded the way that Professor Lee responded, which is that Singapore went out of its way to offend the great power, China. Nothing of the kind.
Not to say great power, just have the false narrative.
So let me just say, use that as a reflection of the I said I wouldn't use the word insecurity, but I have, of the insecurity with which China continues to navigate a system that it is so well suited for, and that all others would welcome it if it behaved according to the rules. So I think that's how I read this particular situation. Thanks.
Okay, let's go to another question. We want to make sure we have so many wonderful people here who have been
No,
here all
we
day.
just mentioned about according to the rules. Jing Liqun, the president, departing president of IIEP, said that U.S. or some other Western country want to change the rule of ping pong games, but they never want to change the rule of golf or tennis, because Western country had advantage, but have disadvantage in ping pong. Then they change the rules, but still China still dominates. This tell you about the changing rules. This is a kind of irony. Yeah.
I saw a hand right here. Yeah.
Thank you. Fascinating discussion. I've been involved in quite a number of international organizations, and I want to point out that there is one or maybe two setting in international organizations that is quite important, and that is the Bank for International Settlements and also the Financial Stability Board under the G20. The reason why I raise these two is that they have a very clear agenda, and I have been involved in these task forces and whatnot, to be apolitical, right? And in a way, you need the financial market, and time and again, you've seen financial market reactions as a discipline to political decisions, both sides, right? So the question then is, where do you, financial stability has, financial market is so integrated these days, you can't reverse it. You can reverse globalization all you want, but the financial markets are so integrated now. And financial stability cannot be confined in one particular market. It has to be global. That's why BIS, being a central bank setting, which in itself is apolitical, have a culture of striving towards a very apolitical way of setting standards, setting regulatory standards, and promoting innovation and whatnot. So let's assume that, for example, maybe some of you have already mentioned the IMF model, the WTO model. The reason why it's gone astray is because it's injected the political element into it, right? I mean, you can disagree with that, but some would make that argument. So I just want to mention that if there is ever an institution, multilateral or otherwise, mostly multilateral, that have a culture and an interest in being apolitical, let's protect that. Let's make greater use of that. That's point number one. Point number two, I think that some of you are quite excited about that debate between the two. my only observation is that we are better off having that debate than not. Right. Now, on one hand, the so-called exercising powers and whatever the competition, but if you think about it, some may argue that it's in response or in reaction to something else, right, or the other side. Or it could be that there is always this narrative or this discussion politically, or also you've seen in the 15th Five-Year Plan about you're not just going out overseas, venturing international capital markets or international markets. You're trying to bring value to the society. You're trying to be sustainable. Okay, beforehand you've got the anti-pollution measures that drove factories to Vietnam. Okay, so then basically that become pollution-driven going out. But no, this is not anymore. My argument is that on one hand, mainland China, we need to be very clear that this debate is on, and we need to acknowledge that whether we agree to it or not. Let's acknowledge that, and I think Chinese leadership, they do. We may not agree with it, but let's acknowledge that. Then the second question: are we bringing value to when we export our goods, when we export our services? Are we bringing the consumption that we need to buy from the other side so we can have this rebalancing if we want? If we can have that discussion, and this is a continuous discussion, we can never. So to your point, I don't think this debate is concluded. It's ever not going to be ever concluded, to be frank. But let's have that discussion. Let's be aware, and let's continue with being apolitical. Thank you.
So that was not exactly a question, but would anybody like to respond? So, any responses to that, or should we go to a question?
We'll take a few questions.
Okay, we'll take a few. We'll go to this gentleman here.
Well, thank you. At the end of the day, competition between great powers is not just competition for vision. Not just that. It's simply competition for influence. Now, you would look at the latest national security strategy. It's not as Trump administration is walking away from seeking more influence. Well, just witness the revival of the Monroe Doctrine or the Dawn Road Doctrine of the Western Hemisphere, right? And then in the Asia Pacific, the United States is doubling down, not walking away from the first island chain. Again, with its allies, with Japan and South Korea, with the AUKUS, with Philippines, to contain the rise of China. And now you have the latest episode of a possible rise of Japanese militarism, characterized by this hawkish lady Prime Minister Takaichi. And further complicating the situation is the question of Taiwan. So my question to the panel is that, bearing in mind all these dynamics, competition for influence, and all these military-related maneuvers and geopolitics, would that lead to a degree of instability in our neighborhood, in the Asia Pacific?
Okay, so we've got a comment on the advisability of keeping multilateral institutions apolitical. And then we've got this additional question about the complexity of competition. Would anybody like to respond?
Want to say something?
Yeah.
So Enoch is right. There are many global development banks and international trade and financial institutions are explicitly organizing in a way to be apolitical. By that I mean, if you read the charters of those organizations, overwhelmingly they refrain from mentioning politics. So for the political nature of a government is not a requirement for membership. The only exception I know is the EBRD. EBRD actually has explicit promotion of democracy written to charter that make it very special. But even with EBRD, EBRD actually admits China as a shareholding countries. All other institutions explicitly stay away from this. That's one observation. Second observation, on the other hand, every government sitting at the board of any of those institutions has to be political in some way, and therefore how much politics they bring into this may depend on the needs. So at the moment, I want to echo one thing that Danny said. There's actually incompatible way of thinking about what's good for the world. From a human well-being point of view, it is generally a positive sum case. One country's prosperity generally does not happen at the expense of others. We have a lot of positive sum win-win cases. On the other hand, countries, at least elites of countries, care more than just improvement of well-being of their citizens. They also care about relative ranking of the country. There can only be one number one country. So that certainly does matter. And when you feel like your number one position gets threatened, or when you feel like your number two position, or if you think you have a right to go from number two to number one, and you think your path gets blocked, either way, you might bring your politics into the operation of the multinational institutions. Indeed, we see examples of that as well. So even BIS, the example you gave, the apolitical institution, I'm aware of at least one case in which one important member country thinks BIS was doing something that will promote the usage of another country's currency that they think would be unhelpful to their interests, and they get BIS to block it. I'm sure you at least indirectly be involved in it. So even ostensibly non-political institutions can certainly become political in certain ways. That's just the reality. That's the world we live in. I guess the point I would add is that I understand why countries think national powers and so on is important beyond just improvement of the citizens' well-being. I want to suggest that currently in our public discourse globally, there's too much discussion about competition. Even like AI, the topic of the last session, that's the standard media discussion about who wins the AI race, and not much insufficient discussion about complementarity. So the fact that US leads innovation, China good with application, and the open source application can be used by all firms around the world is a good thing. So there's sort of a insufficient attention to positive sum nature of many of those things. I think is really terrible for the world. So I'm not saying to be naive to ignore politics part, but I think we perhaps as an intellectual community have a responsibility to try to rebalance that discussion a bit and emphasize positive sum nature a bit more so that the whole world can be made better off.
I think Danny had a comment.
Okay, thank you. Just 2 quick points, if I may. On the question about competition for influence, I think any state, if it's long-term strategic thinking, knows that that is a good thing. The question that we have is, do we think the United States is a long-term strategic thinker at this point? Because it has pulled out of NATO, it's pulling out of World Health Organization, it's pulling out of WTO, it walked out of the Paris Climate Agreement. My friend Graham Allison, who wrote The Thucydides Trap, says he can imagine a world where America goes back into a situation where it is surrounded only by friends and fish. Friends to the north and south, fish to the east and west, and it does not need to look beyond that. But we will have to see, because this is a question about what America wants. To be very clear, all the rest of us want America to be in this world. This world is better with America in it. But if it doesn't want to be, today America only trades 11% of total world trade. So the world trades with itself 8 times more than it does with the United States. If America decides to retreat, we will lump it, but we will be okay. Now, on the question about the Cold War, hugely important, will that lead to stability? Because we have to remember that during the Cold War, terrible, terrible things could have happened. But it was also a situation where no Soviet soldier was in direct combat with any American soldier. They fought proxy wars. They tried to keep it under control. They knew that nuclear conflagration was too horrible to imagine. They also collaborated on different kinds of nuclear arms agreements, and they collaborated on a smallpox vaccine. They did the right thing, even if it was for the wrong reason. And I can imagine that if we go to a new type of Cold War, it would have to be different, but we might be able to recreate a stable equilibrium. The one wrinkle in that was that back then, people knew that if you set off a nuclear weapon, that was it. It was the end of humanity. Today, there are leaders in the world who talk openly about tactical nuclear strikes. That is a complete change in the ballgame. So we'll have to watch this space. Thank you for your question.
I just wanted to quickly note that the United States has not pulled out of NATO.
Yeah.
No, I didn't. Sorry, I misspoke. Sorry, if I said that, I misspoke.
WTO.
Apologies. I wrote down WTO, but it has certainly instructed all the other members of NATO they needed to do more to defend themselves, and that's
Absolutely.
a fine statement. Absolutely. Sorry, I misspoke.
Well, yeah, I want to answer the questions that you raised about the importance of debate. I think debate already takes place in the Chinese leadership and the Chinese political narrative. It's the word of involution, but also the Commerce Secretary Minister said that the externalization of involution is equally important. China should be aware of that. So this is the echo what Daniel said, that many other countries are very concerned China's ever-growing power, particularly manufacturing power in Europe, in other regions. So Chinese catchword is the inclusive growth, trying to make the cake bigger, but that's difficult. I think this is, I hope that they will emphasize that more. The issue of the region, certainly the nuclear proliferation is a serious problem. And this is related to the fact that the insecurity, this is mutually reinforced insecurity. From Chinese perspective, they think that we want to maintain the status quo of Taiwan. You want to push, right? Because China is ever-growing military power. But the U.S. think that China assertiveness, there's policy change, there's a timetable. This is, I talked to Chinese leaders, they said, we never have a timetable. I can go to the details. But one thing I want to echo, of course, we all know that U.S. and China faces domestic challenges. This is very, very important, as Kelly mentioned. I don't know whether you agree with me or not, but the nature of the domestic challenges are different. They are in the different levels. Which is more serious? I think U.S. is more serious. Because China, at least in my observation, you may not agree, China can maintain political unity, social stability, and policy continuity. But the U.S. at the moment, you cannot claim any of these. Vicious partisan politics, racial tension, economic disparity, cultural war, and many, many other problems. So that makes this moment something that is different. But treating them as equal, I always think is problematic. So again, this view may or may not share by Chinese. I think the top leadership are probably more aware, or they think they should have confidence. But the local level, local leaders, business community, intellectual community may not have the same view. So that could be a serious problem in China's development in the future. So that go back to the point that the discussion, like a debate of this, is very, very important.
Let's take a couple more questions.
Yes.
Any over on this side? If there's none here, we'll go over here.
Sorry. Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm Wesley from HKU Journalism and Politics. So I want to first thank all the speakers for their engaging conversations. My question is about, since in the conversation you have talked about, the Trump administration and the Xi administration, which is more about personality and characters. So my question is, so when in the post-Trump and or post-Xi era, whether there will be changes in the U.S.-China engagement, whether there will be a continued confrontation or will there be a better development when it comes to relations? Thank you.
That is actually an interesting question because there was some continuity, certainly in economic policy, from the first Trump to then the Biden administration. So that's a really interesting point. Let's take another question, too. We can try to group them together because we've got just about 14 minutes left. Yes. A mic is coming your way.
Good afternoon. I'm Fiona. I graduated from Hong Kong University like 13 years ago, and I was engineering major. And a lot of senior guys here, we know each other for many years. My only question was, we all know that Indian, USA, and China has long time different kind of relationship. We talk about Japan, Korean, even Taiwan was inside of this circle. So we are talking about the economic relations. We have to talk about politics, but sometimes we have to trading policies. There must be something inside of the underneath what's really going on. Luckily, we are dealing with academic conference here. So no matter who's sitting here can speak something freely without worrying about anything. So the clearly question was about everyone must know something underneath what's really the core relations between them. And I would like to know how you think about it. I would like to first start from Professor Danny and then Lisa, Professor, and others. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we can take those. Should take one more then? Okay, one more question. Yes, sir, over to you.
Thank you very much. Professor Wei was talking some time ago about China's new multilateral development bank initiatives through the IIEP and the new development bank. But my understanding is that the sums of money lent through those banks is rather minor, and that China's main development finance for infrastructure is through bilateral banks. That is to say, through the Exim Bank and through also the China Development Bank. And so China's leadership in development finance is not really through multilateralism, it's through bilateralism.
Okay, three very different questions. Okay.
So probably let me answer the first question about the post-Xi and the post-Trump. This will be many years, and some Americans think that Donald Trump will seek the third term, and almost for sure she will have a fourth term, so we have 7 years. But your question imply the deterioration via China relations may be related with leaders. I don't think so. I think it's a structural problem. So the continuity, from first Trump administration to Biden to Trump, U.S.-China relation continue with a lot of challenges. The same things that I think that the Chinese leaders also largely reflect the ever-growing power of China, the whole country. But I think it's important to acknowledge both leaders want to meet next year. Could be as many as somewhere between 2 to 4 meetings, right? The Donald Trump already announced April. So before April, I think we are safe. This is very, very important because there's a lot of uncertainties, but that's certain he will come. Even there's incidents probably not strong enough, we change that. This is not supposed to change the direction, but prevent the free falls of a bilateral relationship. If there's no such a visit, probably education exchanges are in jeopardy. You look at the bills in the U.S. Congress, some of the other issues probably were out of control. So I think that's very, very important. So I think we're blessed that these two leaders will meet, and probably will meet several times next year. But after that, we do not know. So I think that we really enter a period, the relationship should be really managed. I think there's tremendous interest behind of these leaders. Both countries, they don't want to really have a military confrontation. I think this is share the things. But again, at the moment, certainly there's so many challenges. I think that that's, again, is paradoxically, on one hand, I don't think leaders is the most important factor, but maybe secondly important factor, they can help. So this is my view about your question.
Okay. I'm going to speak to the question from the engineering major, if I may. The others are all really interesting. Try and catch me afterwards, and I'll try and give answers. But the question here was about how, the interplay between the politics and the economics. Okay. And I think here, I'm completely agreeing with Kelly and Professor Lee that China has an optimistic message for the world. Common destiny, win-win outcomes, shared prosperity. That's something everyone can buy into. Where the rest of the world feels difficult. So economics is in a good place. Where the rest of the world feels difficult is that we are unsure about the sustainability of the economic competition that's ahead of us. And we need some reassurance on that regard. The politics is, I'm afraid, much less optimistic. Okay. It used to be that economics could hold against the politics. So just like Bill Clinton said, we go into the WTO, it'll come out right, it'll come out well. But today the politics is quite ugly. There is a view among some, first, the old politics view, one that was articulated by people like John F. Kennedy early on, that sometimes gets brought out by Europeans and Americans, is that this is humanity's final twilight struggle between democracy and freedom and authoritarianism and tyranny. Nobody believes that. Nobody believes that that's the way it is now. However, there are considerable chunks of the policy-making polity who think that, the analysis of those like John Mearsheimer could be correct. That, Americans are naive if they think that America, being a noble democracy, will behave differently than authoritarian, ruthless states that it stands in enemy positions against. America will behave exactly the same way as all other powers in international politics. It acts in a zero-sum game, and it does everything it can to preserve its position. That is what we need to watch out for, and we have to look for every opportunity to keep telling the good economic story, to keep telling the multilateralism and cooperation story. Thank you.
Question on development finance?
I wanted to point out that even though this is a panel on multilateralism, because you're asking about the underlying politics of it, I think thinking about a multipolar world is very relevant here. And specifically, the U.S. the current administration has accused Europe of civilizational erasure because it's allowed too many immigrants in. I mean, this is just picking, but I've been speaking with various, European diplomats, and they are gravely concerned about what's going on. I mean, I think Europeans, there's potential there for, in terms of a node. I mean, they're not in agreement with everything. Clearly, Germany's still investing in China, and so it's not necessarily in an oppositional way, but to China, but perhaps banding together to cope with an erratic U.S. at the moment. So I just wanted to point that out as a relevant political node, as it were.
So two things. First of all, it is so AI. I didn't check I think AIB and NDB's loan portfolio is somewhere on the order of like $30 trillion a year. Someone probably check. So $200 billion to $300 billion range, and that's so AIB and ADB probably has comparable size by now, has more membership, but probably loan portfolios similar, and so Chinese bilateral loans through the National Development Bank and Exim Bank probably is bigger. Yeah, check and let me know the exact numbers. This won't be unusual. The U.S. bilateral capital flow will outnumber whatever U.S. contribution through World Bank is well. Bilateral loans do their own thing. They don't have to observe multilateral institutions. However, my understanding is that even those National Development Bank loans, often they talk about, they have a financial safeguard, but they also talk about green pro-climate agenda as well. So they are not completely divergent, and they talk about learning from existing practices. They can be improved. There's a ongoing discussion about how can existing Paris Club member countries can offer that induce China to join it. China is not currently joining this, and one of the questions about whether the existing loans to other member countries, how do they work? Some of them are not working out. And those some of the borrowing countries can have sustainability problem, and what is the best international practice to work there out. So I think there's hope that some mechanism can be worked out to do that. My understanding is the both existing Paris Club countries and China are looking for middle grounds for that framework to be done. For example, they both agreed to some IMF-sponsored framework to do this. I want to say very briefly on the question about the post-Trump, post-Xi. Well, that question first assumed there will be a post-Trump, post-Xi transition, which may or may not happen. But I'm an eternal optimistic. I want to say two things. I think the U.S. views towards global rules perhaps is an aberration of the current administration. That post 2028, we may very well see a correction from the U.S. side. Certainly, I very much hope so, and I think U.S. has historically we like to think everything happening now is historical first, but there, U.S. political system have many ups and downs, and overall, is in the trajectory of correcting its own mistakes. So I'm thinking U.S. will go back to a rule-based system. That's one point. Second point I want to say, even though I talk about views towards China often have too much hostility and biases, I also want to stress that having more rules, having more constraints on Chinese conduct in global rules is good for the world and good for China well. We don't want a system in which national governments, including Chinese governments, can behave unconstrained. So constraint is good for China and for the world. One of the biggest black swan that can affect the economic prosperity of China, Hong Kong, many other countries is a potential war in the Asia Pacific. In that regard, if there are international institutions or other forces that can reduce or minimize the risk of a war, will turn out to be certainly good for people in Hong Kong, maybe good for people in China and elsewhere. So I want to.
So we are with 1 minute left, and I am going to take the chair's prerogative of thanking our amazing panelists, thanking all of our participants, our conference committee. I'm going to hand the mic in 1 second to Professor Saranovic to offer an additional thanks to our whole group. I know how hard the team has worked on all this, but this has been a terrific conversation. Thanks to all of you. What a great way to wrap up today's conversation. And Steve, I know you might want to say just a last.
Thank you. I don't have too much more to add because this has been a fantastic event. Great panels, great conversations, great discussions. This is our first time bringing this conference to Asia, to Hong Kong, and I don't know, I think we should do it again sometime. What do you think? Thank you all.